Hi, church. Yesterday was Memorial Day, a day when we rightly honor those in our armed forces who have given their lives in the service of our country. And I don't think I'm exaggerating the number to say that it's around 1 million since our country's inception. And there are various memorials to them, both local and in our nation's capital. And again, I think it's a well-deserved day of honor. A lot of times a verse that you hear on Memorial Day is Jesus' words to his disciples in John 15:13, where he said, "Greater love has no one than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends." And of course, that is true of our military veterans who have given their lives. It was also a foreshadowing of what Jesus himself would do for us in laying down his life on the cross. But sometimes I think that we forget that as individual believers, we are also called to lay down our lives for one another. We're called to put the interests of others before our own interests. And nowhere is that spelled out more clearly than in that wonderful passage in Philippians 2, where Paul talks about what Jesus did. Beginning in verse 3, Paul says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." And there, what Paul is doing is first he instructs the Philippians, you need to put one another first. And the reason you need to do that is that you need to have the same attitude in you that Jesus had when he left the glory of heaven, laid aside his rights as God, and came to earth to die on our behalf. And it really is a call for us as believers to a life of sacrifice. A life of sacrifice that sometimes is material, as we sacrifice in our giving or in our generosity. It sometimes is an actual sacrifice of our physical lives, as many believers through the centuries and around the world have done. But more often for us here in America, it's a sacrifice of what we believe to be our rights, or the things that we're entitled to, the things that we want, our own preferences. And Paul says we need to follow Jesus' example. We need to be willing to lay those things aside. We need to be willing to deny ourselves, to give up our rights willingly so that somebody else could be honored, so that we are giving preference to others, so that we are putting others first. So this week, as we've had this Memorial Day off and celebration, and have thought maybe in kind of solemn remembrance of those who have given their lives for our freedoms, I would pray that we would be people who would also be willing to give up our rights for the good of others. Let's start that today. Let's start it with our families and our neighbors, the people in our church, and let's have that cause a ripple effect around the world that would show that we are Jesus' disciples because we are loving and sacrificing just as he did.